Our next guest is a lawmaker who just introduced what's known as the Index Act, that stands for Investor Democracy is Expected. The bill is intended to rein in the voting power that big asset managers like BlackRock and Vanguard typically have over public companies these days. That power sometimes has led to a greater emphasis by the asset managers on environmental, social, and governance principles. For more on this, let's bring in the man who introduced the bill, Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska. And Senator, welcome. Why did you introduce this bill?
Good morning, Becky. Well, look, it's a simple bill, and it is intended to get the voting power back to the beneficial owners of the shares, not to the index fund managers. And the big reason is the market distortion of the power that these index fund managers have. Think about the numbers. Now, they fluctuate depending on where the market is, but over $20 trillion managed by the big three, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. Over 25% of all shares voted on in public companies are voted on by these three, and they're the largest shareholder in over 90% of the S&P 500 companies. And so to me, that is an enormous market distortion, and we need to bring the shareholder power back to the beneficial owners of the shares. This is really a quirk in the law that they have this much power to vote the shares. Nothing against these companies. They've done a great job in terms of lowering fees and doing passive investments, which many American investors want. But they don't want them to have all the power, particularly in terms of corporate governance.
Yeah, Senator, that's a pretty rational argument. That's something that's been argued by a lot of big investors, too. You know, Charlie Munger's brought this up. Warren Buffett brought it up at the Berkshire Hathaway meeting. But you have a lot of co-sponsors. None of them are Democrats. What's in the bill that would keep Democrats from wanting to sign off on this? I mean, it makes sense to give the power of the vote back to the person who actually owns the shares.
Yeah, Becky, you mentioned my co-sponsors. Take a look at some of the smartest, in my view, U.S. senators in terms of issues of corporate finance and American investing. Pat Toomey, among others, Mike Crapo. But I will tell you this, I've been in discussions with a lot of Senate Democrats, and many are very interested in this issue, from some of the more moderate Democrats to some of the most liberal Democrats. And they're all concerned about what I am concerned about, this huge market power and market distortion that really isn't meant to be. Again, think about those numbers I just put out there in terms of their dominance. That is something that usually concerns members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. And I will tell you this, so I was very close to getting a couple of very prominent Democrats to co-sponsor this. So there's a lot of bipartisan interest in my bill, I can tell you that.
Senator, here's the complicated part, and I'm curious where you land on this. The truth is that most people who buy into a 401k plan, put money in various indexes, it's sort of a set it and forget it situation. Most of them are not studying the market. They're not studying the companies in those indexes. They're not interested in it. It's unfortunate, but it's a reality of the situation. Unfortunately, it's actually similar to our democracy in that most people don't vote. They let others vote for them. And that's sort of, in a way, what's happening here. And so the question is it to take the power away from a BlackRock or a State Street to vote at all? Is it to just simply give them the option? And in some cases, that's what's happening now. That option is there in a way that it perhaps wasn't before. What's the right answer there in the balance?
Well, Andrew, it's a really good question, and it's a combination of both. And I know you've talked to Larry Fink. I mean, BlackRock is already starting to do this themselves. And remember, they don't dig into all the details of each of these companies either. They invest in the broad base index funds. So it's not as if they're getting involved in the nitty gritty of each of the companies they invest in terms of management, in terms of what they want having done for that company. But I will tell you this, you know, I think it's a little condescending to say, well, heck, the average American doesn't vote the shares, which is true. Therefore, they shouldn't even have the opportunity or power to do it. In many ways, not voting is a vote itself. So to me, it's both too much power with these index funds, who were never meant to dominate corporate governance in the market like this, never meant to do that. It's really an outgrowth of their success, but also to make sure that investors who are the beneficial owners, if they want to vote, they can vote. And that's what my bill does.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's a pretty rational conversation about an issue that is important to Wall Street. Let's get to one that really gets people heated up, and that's what's happening with oil and gas prices right now. Alaska, in particular, is a nation that is a state that has a huge amount of crude production. But your gasoline prices at the pump are some of the highest in the nation, north of $5 a gallon right now in your state.
You know, Becky, I was home over the weekend, and this is the issue. High prices at the pump, high inflation prices that are crushing American families, they're crushing middle-class families, working families in my state. And this is a self-inflicted wound. From day one, this administration has been focused on shutting down the production of American energy, limiting pipelines and infrastructure, getting investment firms to squeeze off capital to the energy sector. And, you know, since I was last on your program, let me give you 3 additional examples of this. The Biden administration canceled the Cook Inlet lease sale 2 weeks ago. That's a big hydrocarbon production area in Alaska. They took half of the National Petroleum Reserve of Alaska off the table for development. That's probably the hottest oil reserve in the world right now in terms of discoveries. And they issued new NEPA rules just 3 weeks ago that are clearly meant to make it harder to permit pipelines, permit LNG terminals. So this is a full hostility towards the energy sector. They've been doing it since day one, and it's clearly the reason we have higher energy prices in America that's driving all of the inflation challenges that we have in this country right now.
Senator, I'd say that those are some of the reasons. I don't think they're all of the reasons. I think there are a lot of reasons, including ESG being part of the reason that there's been pressure on the oil companies not to spend more on CapEx. And, you know, listening to their shareholders who say we want returns. We don't want more CapEx. We want returns on some of these things. So they're paying back their shareholders who have been long suffering for some of these issues. And look, let's also face it. This is also a refinery issue, a trouble with refinery. And your state knows that well. You have a lot of crude, but you don't have refinery capacity. So you have to take the crude you get, ship it down to places like California and Texas and have it come back. And that's part of the reason your state has always had some of the highest prices in the nation. I mean, there are many issues to kind of, in many places you can put blame for why we're dealing with these high prices right now.
Well, look, I mean, we have some refinery capacity in Alaska, but it is limited. But I will tell you this, in terms of moving energy, this administration is not willing to actually permit energy infrastructure, whether it's pipelines like Keystone, whether it's LNG terminals that we need. And you mentioned ESG. I mean, that is tied into my legislation, the Index Act that we just talked about. You know, there's always this mention that investors don't want it. Well, maybe BlackRock doesn't want it, but I think the average American recognizes that we need to produce more American energy. There was a poll recently, over 60% of Americans think we need to produce more American energy from our own country. So that's where I think the market is disconnected from the average American. And we're seeing that in terms of the prices at the pump. Natural gas prices have doubled in the last 2 years. These are things that are really impacting not just the economy, but working families throughout the country.
Senator Sullivan, thank you. Appreciate your time this morning.
Thanks, Becky.